Hello guys, this is Mr. Harris here. So this first video I want to focus on the classical model for aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So before we get into any movements, let's just go ahead and clarify that we understand what each of these lines indicate. So the AD here, I better turn my pencil on. The AD here indicates the aggregate demand, and keep in mind a calculation for this is actually the same as GDP. Now, are these two things identical? Not really, right? One is the actual eventual output, right? And you can measure GDP three ways: expenditure, income, or output. But in this case, we will use SIG XM, cigarette XM, right? Consumer plus investments, so for businesses, plus government, plus exports minus imports. Now, the SRAS and LRAS is a distinction made in classical economics, but not Keynesian, right? Because in classical economics, these two things are different. If you remember sticky wages, that's a good word to remember, sticky wages, the fact that you can't just pay people one salary in February and one in March, because you have things like contracts, you have things like government laws that will prohibit, quick changes in salaries. So that is why it is slower to adjust, and it's differentiated from LRAS. Now, when it comes to LRAS, we should go ahead and clarify what could move it as well as what it indicates. So the long run aggregate supply indicates the total capacity capable of a country when it's at full employment. Now, this can shift to the right and to the left. For example, you can have things like changes in labor force as well as the quality in labor force. So if, let's say you have an increase in immigrants, your LRAS would shift to the right. You also have things like discovery of land. So let's say, it's not just any land, but land that you can extract natural resources from, that would shift it to the right. Things like laborers getting more education, that would shift it to the right, because high-skilled workers are more valuable than low-skilled workers. I can guarantee you, for example, I think Norway and let's say Madagascar, you know what, I'm just going to Google that very quickly. Norway is 5 million. Madagascar is 30 million, so that doesn't quite work. But let's say Madagascar is 30 million. I want to say Spain is probably something close to that. Even though both countries are, about 30 to 50 million, the potential of the Spanish market is just so much higher because people are much more highly educated and higher skilled on average in Spain than in Madagascar. We can have things like technology that can shift things also to the left and right. Now that we know all these parts, let me just go ahead and make sure we have an equilibrium here. We'll call this P1. And one final note here about the FE. That indicates about 95%. Why isn't 100? Well, if you remember structural and frictional unemployment, right? Those are unemployments when people's skill sets don't match the job market, or frictional is like when people are just in between jobs. That should exist. So you never really want it to be 100. So a good example of a country that is kind of above you want to be that rate is Japan, for example, is 97.5%, and many people would consider that to actually be too high, right? You want unemployment to be at about 4.5%. Now, okay, so we got all this information here. Let's go ahead and talk about movements along the curves and what the reaction to those movements are. So let's start by shifting aggregate demand. So with aggregate demand, let's start with it going... it's kind of crowded on this right side here, so let's go ahead and just shift it down. So we're going to say aggregate demand has gone down. We'll call this AD2. Now, keep in mind, for AD2 to go down, that means C or I or G or X have to decrease and M has to increase in order to lower aggregate demand. Now, this can happen in a myriad of ways. We're not going to go over every single one, but just here are some examples. For consumers, maybe we have lower interest rates, or higher interest rates. With higher interest rates, people don't want to borrow money. It's going to shift to the left, right? Lesser spending. With I, you could have things like higher corporate tax. With higher corporate tax, businesses are going to have less money to invest in, and therefore they are going to not spend as much money. Government spending. Let's say government, and this is a good word to know, so I'm going to go ahead and write it down here. When government chooses not to spend money, it's called austerity. Now, when governments spend less money, that means there's less money floating around GDP-wise. That will also shift aggregate demand to the left. And finally, X and M, exports and imports. So for example, let's say the government raises interest rates. If they raise interest rates, that will strengthen a currency. So just to confirm over here, we'll say rise in interest rates. That means other countries are going to invest more. So we'll just say US dollar. So what used to be $1 to, let's say, 120 yen is now going to become $1 to 140 yen. Because what has happened? Well, more countries are investing in US bonds. The dollar is going up in value, and now it's stronger. And this creates less exports over here, right? We've lost exports, and people are going to buy more from abroad, taking advantage of that superior purchasing power. So now it's just left. So now we have a shift in equilibrium, right? Where we were originally starting off at this nice, beautiful point here, we'll just call this 1. We have now shifted down here to 2, which means we also do have a new price point as well as a new GDP. We'll call this Y1. So GDP is now a lesser than it was before, and we have experienced a decrease in price, also known as deflation. Now, this is where it gets important. Keep in mind that in the classical model, we always come back to LRAS, right? We're gonna come back here naturally. We do not need government intervention. In fact, an example we looked at in class was the example of Latvia, right? Where in Latvia, their bank, second largest bank, was bankrupt. What else happened? I think their exports ended up decreasing because they weren't able to produce as much, and they ended up in this point 2, right? Where prices got lower and GDP shrunk. But the thing is, we always go back to here. So how the heck does that happen? Well, if we look at the SRAS, a big part of supply is wages, right? Costs money to run a business. And let me make that thicker. There we go. Costs money to run a business. There we go. It costs money to run a business, and one of those major costs is wages. And what has happened now, I know it's a little messy there, but with SRAS2, is because the wages are now cheaper, right? When we're at this point 2 here, prices are cheaper. So if I own an Italian restaurant, it costs a little less now to pay the chefs. It costs a little less now to pay my waiters. So maybe I'm, keeping the restaurant open an extra day a week. So in theory, SRAS shifts to the right. And when SRAS shifts to the right like this, boom, we have our final stage of this movement, which is, we'll call this point 3. We are now back, right? We're back at our full capacity, but we do finish with a change when it comes to price. If you notice, price now has dropped all the way down to P3. And what's another word for this? Deflation. And a note I'd leave with you here is Deflation and inflation, like many other things we study in economics, depends on who the stakeholder is and what the goals are for the country. So, for example, an advantage of lower prices would be things like businesses have lower costs now to run things. So just to kind of give you an anecdotal example, but I think a very powerful one would be, let's say that Italian restaurant I'm talking about, let's say they took on a pretty large mortgage 3 years ago. Well, they made those loans in 2022, right? When we were still up here, when prices were expensive. So now, sorry, that's a, I don't know if I just said that, but so now they're making, lesser money. So that would be a negative of deflation, is that if you'd borrowed money prior, you're still paying back these prices, right? Even though you're making this amount of money. Now, there are pros to deflation, and this is that because everything is cheaper, now, if I want to buy that new stove for my restaurant, maybe I wanted to hire a third chef, but I've been very hesitant at this price up here. But now at this price, I can hire that third chef. So again, it just depends on who we're talking about, and even and that was kind of more of at a micro scale, right, business-wise. But even for countries, depending on what they're looking for policy-wise, deflation or inflation could have positive or negative purposes. But that's probably a bit more, we'll do that in April. But yeah, there you have it. That's kind of just running through the gauntlet there of AD shifting, right, from AD to AD2, right? We have essentially a lower GDP because of a variety of factors. Again, there's at least 20 things you can talk about there. I talked about 4. And then understanding why from 2 we eventually get to 1, and the reason there is because of SRAS, primarily because costs of things are cheaper. Often wages help companies produce more, and therefore we end up at the end of the day right back to YFE. And there you have it. That's kind of part 1 of what happens here. Now with part 2, I would like to talk and see, I don't know if I can do undo enough times here, which is faster, but I'll just kind of talk as I push this undo. I want to do the reverse. I want to move the AD this time to the right. So what will happen this time is aggregate demand, and we can keep actually what we have some up here, right? Aggregate demand, which is cigarette XM, right? CIG X minus M shifts to the right. So what could make AD shift to the right? Well, if anything brings up CIG or X. So for example, with consumers, interest rates get lower. If interest rates are lower, people are going to buy more. If consumer confidence is high, people are going to buy more. For example, with consumer confidence, something like unemployment. When unemployment is low, consumer confidence is high. Now, if we're talking about businesses, if you have increase in technology, that could increase investment. You can also have more business confidence. That's things like the stock market. Low interest rates, that's going to make businesses buy more. With governments just engaging in any kind of projects, for example, building new roads, building new stadiums because the World Cup's coming, that increases G. Finally, X and M, let's connect this to interest rates again. So with interest rates, let's say interest rates are low. They used to be 5%, now they're 2%. Low interest rates means not many people want to invest in your currency. So going back to that example, let's say $1 equaled 120 yen. If we cut interest rates, now that $1 might be equal to just, we'll say 80 yen. We'll say it's a massive cut in interest rates. So foreign investors aren't wanting to invest in the dollar. What does this mean with the 80 yen? It means, though, people want to buy more U.S. products. So that will increase exports and it will decrease imports. So now let's go ahead and actually make those shifts. So let's go ahead and draw AD2. Kind of overlapping with that text, but that's fine. So we'll call this guy right here AD2. So AD2, for the reasons I just mentioned, have shifted rightward. and that gives us a new equilibrium point. We'll call this P2, and we have greater amount of GDP. We'll call this Y1. Now, a great question here would be, how the heck could a country, let's make that thicker, there we go. How the heck could a country go beyond its maximum? Right? How is that possible? I thought YFE means we are totally maximizing all our possible production, our possible capacities. Well, the key word here is unsustainable. So for example, if it's a temporary thing, workers could be working more hours. And you can even think of this at a more micro level. For example, if someone said, hey, you have to work this week for 16 hours a day, it's doable. People have done that. People have done harder than 16 hours a day. But then if someone said work for 16 hours a day, 5 days a week for the next 5 years, a lot of people are going to get sick. People are going to quit their jobs. It's not sustainable. And the same could be said with land. If Brazil chopped down half the rainforest, they would have incredible results with their economy in the short run. But in the long run, you can't just, use the land you have so recklessly. So yes, we have a higher GDP, but it's temporary, and we have higher prices. Another word for this is inflation. Now, this is temporary, because what happens in the long run? We always come back to this point. So what the heck happens? Well, SRAS is pretty much the reverse of what we just saw earlier. The SRAS, it's getting kind of messy there. There we go, SRAS2. The SRAS, the short run aggregate supply, actually decreases. And why is that? Well, because prices are expensive, right? Laborers cost more money. Fruits cost more money. That meat I used to buy for the pasta is more expensive. So SRAS shifts to the left, right? Production costs are more, and that leaves essentially to our last point, point number 3, where you have pretty much 2 talking points here. One is we finish with P3, so we have much more inflated price levels, where we have inflation. But when it comes to GDP, as classical economists would say, we are just back to where we started, right? The free market has corrected itself. Now, on the final note here, same thing I kind of mentioned a second ago about inflation. Inflation has its pros and cons, right? For example, if you borrowed money 3 years ago, well, you borrowed money at this point, right? But now you're making this kind of money. So it's easier to pay past debts off. The cons is purchase power is lower, right? If I had, let's say, $1 million saved up for my company during this era, well, everything now costs like 30% more money. So that $1 million I have in savings is less now than it was 3 years ago. So as I keep saying, think about stakeholders. It depends on the goal of the government, what they want to happen. So up to this point, let's say if the government was not happy at how prices were and they wanted prices to go up, well, this would be an amazing scenario, right? Because they're facing inflation. A few final points to mention here would be keep in mind some of the key tenets of classical economists. So classical economists are saying that the market corrects itself. They're saying that, yes, there are shifts in the short run, but they're saying in the long run, everything always comes back to YFE. Another thing to consider is how inflation and deflation occurs. You'll notice as aggregate demand goes up, prices also go up, and vice versa. As aggregate demand goes down, prices also tend to go down. This is very different from Keynesian philosophy, where they believe the government can make the economy grow without inflation in its earlier stages. But on that note, I think that was a solid 15, 16 minutes. I'll go ahead and post the Keynesian one too following this video. Thank you for watching, guys, and I hope that was helpful.